Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about this idea of focus and attention management.
Right?
And we're drawing our insights from this book right here called Hyperfocus by Chris Bailey.
Oh, yeah, I've heard good things about that one.
Yeah. So, if you're listening to this, you're probably the kind of person who's trying to, cut through all the noise and really just grab the essential knowledge on something without, feeling completely overwhelmed.
Right, right.
So that's what we're going to do here today. We're going to distill down some of the key ideas about how our attention works in this world of, constant distractions, and hopefully give you guys some practical tools for boosting your own productivity and creativity.
Exactly. We want this to be something you can actually use, not just some theoretical concepts.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So we're going to be getting into things like, what it really means to be on autopilot mode versus, having that intentional focus. And we'll talk about the actual, limitations of our brains when it comes to how much we can actually focus on at once.
Yeah, that's always a humbling realization.
Oh, yeah. And then, of course, we'll get into, what it really costs us when we try to divide our attention, trying to do a million things at the same time.
Right. And then, of course, we'll touch on the power of both intense concentration, like that real hyperfocus, and then also kind of the flip side of that, the importance of letting your mind wander.
Right, exactly, because there's a time and a place for both.
Mm-hmm.
So let's dive right in. I guess one of the first things that really stuck out to me in the book was this idea of autopilot mode.
Okay, yeah.
Now, when we hear that, we might think of, like literally not paying attention, but it's actually a little more nuanced than that, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, think about it this way. Autopilot mode is basically when we're just doing things out of habit without really giving them much conscious thought.
Right.
Think about your morning routine, for example. How you make your coffee the way you always take to work.
Yeah.
You're not really thinking about those things step by step. You're just running on these well-established patterns. And it's actually pretty fascinating. There's a ton of research on this, like the work of Wendy Wood and her colleagues. They've shown how these habits get so deeply ingrained in our brains.
Oh, wow.
That we basically end up acting without making a conscious decision.
Yeah, it's almost a little scary how much of our day can be like that. Just running on autopilot. The book gives this example of like picking up a book to read.
Okay.
And it's like rarely this big, planned out decision like today I will read this insightful book.
Right.
It's more like, oh, you see it on a friend's coffee table. Or maybe you hear an interview with the author.
Right.
And it's just this confluence of events that kind of leads you to it.
Yeah.
So it's less about intention and more about just kind of being nudged in a certain direction. Bailey actually uses this this analogy of a taxi driver.
Okay.
Just passively listening to the radio.
Yeah.
And how that can end up influencing his thoughts and behaviors.
Right.
So it just highlights how easily we can be, kind of led down certain paths without really choosing them.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to be aware of, because if we're not careful, we can end up spending a lot of time on things that aren't actually aligned with our goals.
Exactly. And the book then introduces this idea of intentional focus as the, the counterpoint to that autopilot mode. So intentional focus is about, consciously directing your attention towards something specific that you've decided is important.
Right.
But the crucial part, I think, is that it also includes, being able to notice when your attention is drifted and then bringing it back.
Yes, absolutely. Because let's be real, our minds are going to wander. It's inevitable.
Oh, yeah.
But the key is to be able to catch ourselves when it happens and then gently redirect our focus.
And this brings us to, I think, a really, really helpful framework that the book introduces. It's called the productivity quadrant.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah, so it's basically a way to categorize our tasks based on whether they're necessary or unnecessary, and then whether they serve a purpose or are just a distraction.
Right, so you're basically creating this matrix to evaluate your to-do list.
Yeah, exactly. Can you kind of break that down for us in a way that really makes it stick?
Sure, so imagine a simple cross. Okay, at the top, you've got tasks that are necessary things you absolutely have to do.
Okay.
And then at the bottom, you've got unnecessary things that, maybe you could skip.
Okay.
Then on the left side, you have purposeful tasks, things that are aligned with your goals. And on the right side, you have distracting tasks, things that basically pull you away from your goals.
Got it.
So when you combine these, you end up with 4 quadrants. The top left is your sweet spot. It's necessary and purposeful work. You know, the high impact stuff that really moves the needle.
Okay.
Top right is necessary but distracting. So think about things like admin tasks. You got to do them, but they're not really moving you forward. Bottom left is unnecessary but purposeful. So maybe this is where your hobbies fall or things you enjoy but don't necessarily contribute to your big goals.
Okay.
And then the bottom right, oh boy, that's the danger zone. This is unnecessary and distracting.
The black hole.
The black hole, exactly. You know, mindless social media scrolling, falling down internet rabbit holes.
Yeah.
That's where we find ourselves a lot of the time. And the real insight here, I think, is just being aware of where you're actually spending your time versus where you should be spending it to really achieve your goals.
Yeah. It's so easy to just kind of drift into that bottom right quadrant.
It is, especially when we're on autopilot.
Especially when we're on autopilot, right? It's like our brains are wired to seek out the easy stuff, the novel stuff, even if it's not really good for us in the long run.
And I think it's interesting that the book points out that a lot of times it's only when we have like a deadline looming that we really start to prioritize that top left quadrant.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like we need that external pressure to really snap us out of it.
Right. And I think that just goes to show how important it is to be intentional about our focus. You know, we have to actively choose to work on the important stuff. Otherwise, we'll just end up getting pulled in a million different directions.
Totally. So we've got this idea of autopilot versus intentional focus. We've got the productivity quadrant for, kind of categorizing our tasks. Now let's get into, I guess, the nitty-gritty of what our brains can actually handle.
Okay. Yeah.
It's not like we have an unlimited supply of focus, right?
Not at all, unfortunately. You know, our attention is actually really limited by 2 main things. One is capacity, so we can only process so much information at once, and then the other is duration. We can only stay focused for a certain amount of time before our minds start to wander.
Right, and the book introduces this concept of attentional space, which I thought was a really helpful way to visualize it.
Yeah, it's basically like the mental workspace where all the thinking happens.
Exactly. Can you kind of explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So think of it like the RAM in your computer. You know, there's only so much information you can actively hold and work with at any given time. And Giorgio Marchetti's research has shown how this attentional space is actually really limited. It's where we hold information, manipulate it, connect ideas, but it's not this vast, endless space that we might imagine.
And the crazy thing is just how small this space actually is.
Right.
The book talks about this magic number 4 when it comes to how many distinct pieces of information we can hold in our short-term memory at once.
Yeah, on average, we can only juggle about 4 things at a time.
That feels so much lower than I would have guessed.
It is surprisingly small, and there's a lot of research on this, like Nelson Cowan and others. They consistently find that we hit this limit pretty quickly.
Wow, so our brains are like these tiny little computers with very limited RAM.
In a way, yeah. But the good news is that we've developed strategies to work around this limitation.
Right, like chunking.
Exactly. Chunking is this amazing way that our brains group smaller bits of information into larger, more meaningful units.
Okay, so it's like instead of trying to remember a bunch of random numbers individually,
Right.
we group them together into something that makes more sense.
Exactly. So instead of trying to remember 5867294, you might break it up into 5867 and then 294.
Got it.
So by seeing those as chunks, it's like we're effectively expanding our attentional space.
So we're kind of tricking our brains into holding more information.
In a way, yeah.
Okay, now another concept that I thought was really interesting was this idea of meta-awareness, which is basically being aware of what's actually occupying our mental space at any given moment.
Right. It's like having this bird's eye view of your own thoughts.
Yeah, and it sounds simple enough, but it's actually something I think we often just completely miss.
Oh, absolutely. We're so caught up in our thoughts, we rarely step back and actually observe what we're thinking about.
It's true, and the book gives this example of like driving somewhere and suddenly realizing you've arrived without really remembering the drive itself.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely done that.
Right, and that's like a classic example of a lack of meta-awareness because you were physically doing the task of driving, but your mind was somewhere else entirely.
Right, and the research on this is pretty crazy. Our minds wander something like 47% of the time.
What, 47%?
Yeah, it's a lot more than we realize. So developing this meta-awareness is really about, being able to notice when our focus is drifting so we can gently guide it back to where it needs to be.
And that's where mindfulness comes in, right?
Exactly. Mindfulness is this practice of just observing our thoughts and feelings without judgment.
So it's not about, fighting our thoughts or trying to suppress them.
No, it's more about just acknowledging them and then letting them go.
Okay, and the book also makes this interesting distinction between multitasking with demanding tasks versus habitual tasks.
Right.
And it seems like our brains handle those two things very differently.
They really do. So when you're doing something that requires like your full cognitive power, like learning a new language or having a really deep conversation,
Mhm.
trying to multitask with that is usually a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, you just end up doing both things poorly.
Right, because those tasks are just taking up so much of your attentional space. But on the other hand, our brains are actually really good at juggling habitual tasks.
Right.
Well, think about walking and chewing gum at the same time, or, driving a familiar route while listening to the radio.
Okay, yeah.
Those things have become so automatic for us that they don't really require much conscious effort. So we can actually do them pretty efficiently
Yeah.
while also focusing on something else.
So basically, complex tasks are like these attention hogs.
They are. They really gobble up our mental resources. And the book actually suggests that we can realistically only handle one demanding task and maybe one habitual task at the same time.
Huh.
So you can listen to music while you're cleaning the house, but trying to write a report while also having a complex conversation is probably going to be a struggle.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think we've all experienced that feeling of just complete mental overload when we try to do too much at once.
Right. Because our brains just hit a wall.
And it can manifest in all sorts of ways, like,
Yeah.
Forgetting why you walked into a room.
Oh, yeah.
Or just feeling really scattered and unable to focus.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be mindful of what we're allowing into our attentional space.
Yeah.
We have to be selective about what we're focusing on if we want to maintain some sense of clarity and calmness.
Right. It's like decluttering our minds.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about, the limitations of our attention and how important it is to be intentional about what we focus on.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's talk about what happens when we try to push past those limits.
Okay.
The costs of dividing our attention.
Mm.
The book makes this distinction between multitasking and just shifting our attention.
Right.
And I was curious, what's the key difference there and why does it matter?
So multitasking is really trying to do multiple demanding tasks at the same time.
Okay.
Like trying to write an email while also talking on the phone and also trying to remember what you need to pick up from the grocery store. Whereas shifting attention is just moving your focus quickly from one thing to another.
Yeah.
And I think the key difference is that some level of attention shifting is just inevitable throughout the day.
Uh-huh.
We're constantly having to adjust our focus to respond to different things.
Hmm.
But when we're constantly trying to multitask,
Yeah.
especially with those demanding tasks, it can actually have some pretty significant downsides.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, it affects our learning and memory.
Really?
Yeah, the book talks about some research that shows when we're multitasking while we're trying to learn something, our brains tend to rely more on the basal ganglia, which is the part of the brain that handles skills and habits.
Okay.
But it's not as good at actually storing and retrieving new information, which is what the hippocampus does.
Got it.
So it's like we're using the wrong tool for the job.
Interesting.
So, for example, if you're trying to learn a new language while you're also scrolling through social media, you might pick up some surface level information, but you're not going to encode it as deeply and you're not going to remember it as well later on.
So you're basically short-circuiting the learning process.
You are. And the book also talks about how this affects our experience of time.
Mm-hmm.
When we're constantly multitasking, we're not really fully engaged with anything. So our experiences become less meaningful and we have a harder time remembering how we spend our time.
It's like we're just kind of going through the motions.
Exactly. And then there's this concept called attention residue, which I think is super relatable.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that one.
So attention residue is basically that feeling where even after you switch to a new task,
Mm-hmm.
part of your mind is still stuck on the previous one.
Oh, yeah. I definitely experienced that.
Like, have you ever gone into a meeting right after dealing with a really stressful problem at work?
Oh, yeah. All the time.
And even though you're physically in the meeting, your mind is still kind of back there with that problem.
Totally. And it makes it hard to really focus on what's being discussed.
Exactly. It's like you have all these mental tabs open in your brain and they're just competing for your attention.
Right. And the book also talks about how time pressure, which you might think would help you focus,
Mm-hmm.
can actually hinder creative problem solving.
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive, but when we're under a lot of pressure, we tend to narrow our focus.
Okay.
And we become less able to think broadly and come up with innovative solutions.
So it's like we get tunnel vision.
We do, and we just focus on getting something done rather than getting it done well.
Right. So it sounds like the key is to find that balance between, Having a sense of urgency, but also giving ourselves enough space to think creatively.
Exactly.
Okay, so now let's talk about the flip side of divided attention, which is hyperfocus.
Okay, yeah.
So this is that state of really intense, sustained concentration on a single task.
Mm-hmm.
And the book makes a really compelling case for why this is so beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, when you can really lock in on something and give it your full attention, you can get so much more done in a shorter amount of time.
And the quality of work is usually better, too.
Exactly. And the book also talks about how hyperfocus can lead to these flow states.
Flow states.
Yeah, it's this feeling of being completely absorbed in what you're doing where time just seems to disappear.
Oh, yeah. I've definitely experienced that before.
Yeah, and it's a really powerful state to be in because you're just so focused and energized and the work feels effortless. And the funny thing is that even though you're super focused during those flow states, it's actually less mentally draining than constantly switching between tasks.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because all your mental energy is directed towards one thing, so you're not wasting it on all that context switching.
So it sounds like hyperfocus is kind of the superpower we need in this age of distraction.
It really is, but the question is, how do we actually achieve it?
Right, with all these distractions vying for our attention.
Yeah. And I think the book makes a good point that distractions are often more appealing to us than our actual work because of something called novelty bias.
Novelty bias.
Yeah, our brains are wired to be drawn to new and stimulating things.
So like that ping of a notification or that glimpse of a new headline, it triggers a reward response in our brain.
Got it.
And it makes those distractions really hard to resist, even when we know we should be focusing on something else.
It's like our brains are craving that dopamine hit.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is that we actually interrupt ourselves almost as much as we're interrupted by external sources.
Really?
Yeah, the book cites this research by Gloria Mark, who found that people interrupt themselves just as often as they're interrupted by emails, phone calls, things like that.
Wow, so we're kind of our own worst enemy when it comes to staying focused.
In a lot of ways we are.
Yeah.
And the book says that these self-interruptions can cost us a significant amount of time.
Like how much?
Well, on average, it takes about 29 minutes to fully re-engage with the task after we've interrupted ourselves.
29 minutes.
Yeah, so you can imagine if you're constantly interrupting yourself throughout the day, it really adds up.
So that's a huge productivity killer.
It is, and that's why it's so important to be proactive about creating a distraction-free environment. Right, and the book gives some really practical tips for doing that, like simply putting your phone out of sight.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds basic,
Right?
but it's actually really effective.
It's like out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly.
And I also thought this example from the company Sevenly was really interesting.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
They had these custom-made walnut desk lamps that employees would turn on when they needed a period of uninterrupted focus.
Okay.
And it was like this unspoken rule that if someone's lamp was on, you didn't interrupt them.
That's a cool idea.
Yeah, and they even limited these hyperfocus sessions to 3 hours a day because they found them to be so effective.
Interesting.
So it's like using a visual cue to signal to others that you need to be left alone to focus.
Yeah, and it also creates this sense of commitment for the person who's working because you know you've turned on the lamp. You're signaling to yourself that it's time to buckle down and get stuff done.
Totally. So let's talk about some specific types of distractions.
Okay.
Email is a huge one for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah, it's a constant source of interruption.
And the book really emphasizes just how much of an attention hog it can be.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some strategies for managing email more effectively?
Well, one of the biggest things is to minimize or eliminate notifications.
Right.
Every time your phone buzzes or your computer dings, it pulls you out of what you're doing.
And it takes time to get back into that flow state.
Exactly. So the book suggests turning off those notifications and then setting aside specific times to check your email.
Okay.
Rather than constantly monitoring your inbox.
Like batching it.
Yeah, exactly. Like checking it once in the morning, once in the afternoon, something like that. And the author actually only checks his email once a day around 3 p.m.
Wow.
Yeah. And he uses an autoresponder to let people know that he's not ignoring them. He'll just get back to them later.
Interesting. And there's actually research that shows that checking email less frequently can reduce stress levels.
Right. There was this study where people went without email for a week.
A whole week.
Yeah. And they reported feeling significantly less stressed.
Wow, that's pretty convincing.
It is. It shows just how much low-level anxiety we create for ourselves by constantly being connected.
And what about meetings?
Oh, yeah. Meetings are another big-time suck.
So how do we manage those more effectively?
Well, the book suggests, first of all, really questioning whether a meeting is even necessary.
Right.
Can this be handled over email or a quick phone call?
A lot of times, yeah.
And if you do need to have a meeting, be really ruthless about who you invite.
Mm-hmm.
Only include the people who absolutely need to be there.
Okay.
And then if you are attending a meeting, try to really hyper-focus on it.
So put away the phone and the laptop.
Exactly, unless you absolutely need them.
Okay.
And actively engage in the discussion, help keep things on track.
Right.
That way you're not only being more productive in the meeting, but you're also preventing your mind from wandering and creating that attention residue.
And of course, there's the internet, which is this amazing resource, but also this endless source of distraction.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah. And the book talks about this phenomenon of active daydreaming online.
Right, and I think we've all experienced that.
Oh, yeah, totally.
It's that thing where you find yourself just clicking from one website to the next, one social media post to the next, without any real purpose or intention.
It's like you're just kind of passively consuming information.
Exactly, and it can really suck you in, and, you can end up wasting hours without even realizing it.
So how do we combat that?
Well, the book suggests that sometimes the best thing to do is to just disconnect entirely.
Really?
Yeah, especially when you're working on something important or when you're traveling and you really need to be present in the moment.
Like a digital detox.
Kind of, yeah. It
Yeah.
forces you to be more intentional about how you're spending your time and attention.
And it can be really freeing to just unplug for a while.
It can, and the book also talks about how our physical and digital environments can really influence our ability to focus. And they use this funny example of jelly beans on a coworker's desk.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that.
So the author noticed that his coworker kept this bowl of jelly beans on her desk,
Oh, okay.
but she rarely ate them.
Uh-huh.
But he found them super tempting.
Right.
And it just highlighted how these subtle environmental cues can really impact our behavior.
So it says that if you're trying to eat healthy, but you have junk food sitting out on the counter,
Right.
you're way more likely to give in to temptation.
Exactly. So the book suggests modifying your environment to minimize those tempting cues.
Like keeping unhealthy snacks out of sight.
Yeah. Or putting your phone in a drawer when you're trying to work.
Right. And the same goes for our digital environments.
Yeah.
A cluttered desktop can be just as distracting as a messy desk.
It can. And the book also talks about the role of music in all of this.
Music.
Yeah. I mean, some people swear by listening to music while they work, especially in noisy environments like coffee shops.
Right.
But the research is actually a little bit mixed on this.
Oh,
Yeah. So familiar, simple, and relatively quiet music can sometimes be helpful because it can help to mask distracting conversations and create a more consistent auditory environment.
got it.
But it's important to remember that music still takes up some of your attentional resources.
So it's not like it's completely neutral.
No, and the book mentions that music might actually be more distracting for introverts than extroverts.
Interesting.
Yeah, and also overhearing snippets of phone conversations can be more disruptive than hearing full conversations.
Really?
Yeah, because our brains try to fill in the missing parts of the dialogue.
That's so fascinating.
It is. So if you do use music while you're working, it's probably best to stick with something instrumental and familiar. That way you're not constantly getting pulled out of your focus by trying to figure out what the lyrics are.
Okay, that's really helpful advice.
Yeah.
So we've talked about, understanding how our attention works, how to tame distractions. Now, how do we actually cultivate that ability to hyperfocus,
Okay.
and make it more of a consistent habit?
Right. Well, I think the first step is to understand why our minds wander in the first place.
Right. What are some of those triggers?
Well, the book talks about things like stress boredom, a chaotic environment. If you're feeling overwhelmed or uninspired by a task, your mind is much more likely to wander.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And even the nature of the task itself can play a role. Well, surprisingly, very simple repetitive tasks like basic meditation can actually lead to more mind wandering than more engaging activities.
Really?
Yeah. Because when we're not mentally stimulated enough, our minds tend to search for something more interesting to focus on.
So it's like our brains get bored.
They do, and that's why it's important to have a balance. We need some tasks that are challenging enough to keep us engaged, but not so overwhelming that they stress us out.
Right. And the book also reminds us of Parkinson's law, which states that work expands to fill the time available.
Right. It's like if you give yourself a week to do something,
Uh-huh.
it'll take you a week, but if you give yourself a day,
Yeah.
you'd probably get it done in a day.
So it's about setting realistic deadlines and working with a sense of urgency.
Exactly, even if it's self-imposed.
Now, what about all those brain training programs out there?
Oh, yeah.
Are those the secret to unlocking laser focus?
Well, the research on those is actually a little bit underwhelming.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of those programs might show short-term gains on specific cognitive tasks,
Okay.
but there's not much evidence that they lead to lasting improvements in overall attention span.
So there's no magic bullet.
Not really. It's more about consistent practice and building that mental muscle.
And the book actually compares it to practice of meditation,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting.
Yeah, the more you intentionally direct your attention and resist distractions, the better you'll become at staying focused.
So it's like any skill you have to practice it to get better.
Exactly. And the book introduces this concept of mindful awareness, which I thought was really helpful.
Tell me more about that.
So it's basically about bringing your attention to the present moment during everyday activities,
Okay.
like really paying attention to the sensations of taking a shower or eating a meal. It sounds simple, but it's actually a really effective way to train your attentional muscles.
Because you're basically practicing staying present and focused.
Exactly.
And the book also emphasizes the importance of having dedicated, purposeful time at home to recharge our attentional batteries.
Yes, because our attention is a limited resource and it gets depleted throughout the day.
So we need to give our minds a break.
We do. And
Well-
spending quality time at home doing things that we enjoy,
Yeah.
whether it's connecting with loved ones, pursuing hobbies, that helps to restore our mental energy.
So it's not just about physical rest, it's about mental rest as well.
Exactly. And that ultimately improves the quality of our focus when we need it.
And the book also gives some practical tips for strengthening hyperfocus,
Mm-hmm.
like working in focused bursts with short breaks,
Right.
rewarding yourself for staying on task,
Okay,
continuing to minimize distractions, and setting very specific intentions.
Yeah, that last one is really important because research has shown that when we set specific intentions for ourselves, we're much more likely to follow through.
So instead of just saying, I'm going to go to the gym more,
Right.
you would say, I'm going to go to the gym on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 6 p.m. for 45 minutes.
Exactly. That way you're not leaving any room for ambiguity.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the power of focused attention,
Mm-hmm.
but the book also makes a compelling case for the importance of letting our minds wander,
Right.
which it calls scatterfocus.
Scatterfocus.
And it presents this as being really crucial for creativity.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important point because we live in a culture that's so obsessed with productivity and efficiency that we often forget that downtime is just as important as work time.
And scatterfocus is basically about intentionally allowing your mind to drift, to move away from the task at hand.
Exactly. And it might seem counterintuitive,
Yeah.
but this kind of aimless wandering actually allows our brains to make connections and come up with new ideas.
So it's like we're giving our subconscious minds a chance to work on things in the background.
Exactly. And the book talks about how we've actually become kind of uncomfortable with just being alone with our thoughts.
Oh, yeah. I can definitely relate to that.
Right. Because we're so used to this constant stream of stimulation from our phones and computers.
Mm.
And there's actually a survey that found that the vast majority of Americans report spending no time simply relaxing or thinking.
Wow.
And there was even this experiment where people preferred to give themselves mild electric shocks.
What?
Yeah, rather than just sit quietly with their own thoughts for a few minutes.
That's crazy.
It shows how much we've come to avoid boredom and solitude.
But those things are actually really important for our mental health and creativity.
They are, and part of the reason why we're so drawn to distractions is because of our evolutionary history.
Yeah, how so?
Well, our brains are naturally attuned to novelty, pleasure, and potential threats. Those were the things that were most important for our survival back in the day.
Right.
But in today's world, those same instincts can lead us down endless rabbit holes of distraction.
So it's like our brains haven't quite caught up to the modern world.
Exactly. And so when we do let our minds wander, what do we typically think about?
Good question.
Well, research suggests that we spend about 25% of our time thinking about past,